Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. This is the first in a series of essays that are military blunders and fiascos. So we're going to examine the ins and outs and how something could happen, how such monumental stuff-ups could occur, given that, for the most part at least, the very best military minds available or on the spot were concentrated on making the military operation a success, and yet it turned into an unmitigated disaster, or indeed a fiasco. The first in this series will be the British or Allied raid on the coastal French town of Dieppe during World War II, and this was again a monumental fiasco and disaster. So let's study this, and it's a bit of a deep dive, so buckle up and we'll go through the disaster, how it occurred, what led to it, and indeed the big day as it unfolded. Now, the time's mid-1942, it's World War II, and the Axis powers of Germany and Japan were sweeping all before them. Things were looking pretty good for them. The Japanese were enjoying crowning success around the wider Asian region. Although they had had a naval check at Midway, they still very much held the initiative and the ascendancy. The British had a shock, huge defeat to an inferior Japanese force at Singapore only earlier that year, in fact a few months earlier, and the shock waves of that defeat still had dazed and confused the British General Staff. How could it have happened? How could it have all gone to fall into pieces so quickly and so completely? Similarly, at the time, the British were getting slapped around by the Wehrmacht German General Rommel in Libya and Egypt, and the British forces had just suffered a crushing defeat trying to defend the African coastal port town. This is on the Mediterranean Sea, the town of Tobruk. Many of you may have heard of the term the Rats of Tobruk. Well, this was that same Tobruk. This was a huge embarrassment for Churchill because he was having a meeting with American US President Franklin Roosevelt. He was sitting there talking, and one of Roosevelt's attendants came in and slipped a bit of paper to him. He looked at it and then handed it over to Churchill, and it was there that the Germans had just captured Tobruk. And of course this was in the middle of his meeting with Roosevelt. So the Tobruk defeat had cut quite deep into Churchill. And there are a few reasons for this. So one is just a sheer public relations and propaganda issue of losing such an important battle. Over 30,000 British and Allied troops surrendered to the Germans there at Tobruk. But the General Auchinleck, who was actually quite a good general overall, he'd advocated that they should withdraw. He doubted they could hold Tobruk. And if they did, it would be such huge cost, it wouldn't be worth the effort. And so he advised withdrawal. Churchill overruled him, and as Prime Minister and head of the War Cabinet, he overruled Auchinleck and said, no, you have to hold Tobruk at all costs. And of course, Tobruk was lost, and with it, vast amounts of war material, and of course, over 30,000 British troops as well. So this stung Churchill, as it should have done. He should have listened to the man on the spot, but he didn't. And similarly, at the same time, the Wehrmacht had just opened their summer offensive in Russia after having had a couple of quite decent-sized victories earlier in the year. And that offensive was going pretty well. So there was a feeling that the Red Army, the Soviet armies, would collapse at any minute. So it's into this rather gloomy atmosphere that the British are pondering their very limited military options and what possible strategies could they employ. And the idea was that they could do sort of small pinprick type raids on the German-held French coast, and this would just irritate and annoy the Germans. The Germans had over thousands of miles of coastline going from south of France right up to Norway. They had, give or take, about 1 million men. Most of these were second or even third stringers, men between the age of 40 and mid to late 50s, who many of them had injuries from previous wars or indeed in World War II in the earlier campaigns, and you're missing fingers or missing a leg or something, but they were useful as best they could be. So they weren't frontline troops. The frontline troops were fighting the Red Army in the Soviet Union. So there wasn't much the British considered they could do, and they were at the time were cowed, hesitant, and a defeated military with quite defeatist attitudes, and scared to attempt anything that may even smack of the possibility of getting defeated yet again. So these pinprick raids were about as adventurous as the British military were prepared to be at the time. Now, Churchill, on the other hand, was anxious to redeem himself as a fearless, inspirational warlord, and he was pushing the military to engage in action, any action. Now, Churchill was a big picture, big strategy, big picture guy, as indeed was Mountbatten, and I'll come to him in a minute. And Churchill was always looking for this and dreaming and imagining that there was some strategic masterstroke that could be pulled out of a hat at any time. It would turn it all around, and the British would be on the front foot again. The bottom line is the British military was no match, not even minimal match for the German military, the Wehrmacht, and their confidence had been so beaten and so pushed down by all the defeats they'd suffered that no one had any ideas as to the or illusions rather as to the military might of the British. They just didn't have that military might; it just wasn't there. Now Churchill may think in grand strategy and strategic masterstroke terms and have these vivid imaginary fits of the British Empire 50 or 60 years earlier, but the more sober minds, such as General Brooke and so on, were much more realistic about the capability of the British armed forces at the time. Now, at around this time as well, the American materiel was arriving, American military planning representatives and political representatives and so on. And there was over 500,000 men in arms in Britain, including a decent Canadian contingent. And these people were needed, these soldiers were needed initially because there was a very deep concern that there might be a German invasion or a Wehrmacht invasion. But this was no longer a concern. The Wehrmacht was fully employed in the Soviet Union and the war in the East, so there wasn't going to be any invasions going on. But the Americans were asking, so you've got all these men here, we're giving all this material, so what are you doing to take the fight to the enemy? What are you doing? You're sitting around doing nothing, and what are you going to do? Let's have a look at your plan. And the early American planners military planners who arrived in England were shocked at how little confidence the British military establishment had. Now, the British had recorded a number of silly sort of minor or little fiascos all over the place. For example, they attempted to recapture the Channel Islands, which the Wehrmacht had invaded. So the whole bunch of boats and a flotilla left southern England to go to the Channel Islands, and it was an utter fiasco. Some boats had their navigation was hopeless, and they missed the islands altogether and sort of kept on going into something off in the distance, but they couldn't even find the islands that they were supposed to be invading or recapturing. Others landed on the wrong beaches or the wrong islands, for goodness sakes. Others landed on the right beaches but thought it was the wrong beach, and then they sailed away. So even Churchill described, as he was writing to the Admiralty, said, "Let us have no more silly fiascos like those that were perpetrated during the invasion of the Channel Islands." And these fiascos were over the place. So it goes to show the standard and quality of planning and organisation was very poor. And at a time when they're facing the most formidable military in the world, the Wehrmacht, they needed to really get their house in order and develop a much higher standard of military capability, planning, operation and doctrine. The only arm of the military establishment in Britain that showed any enthusiasm for any sort of a military undertaking or was even prepared to have a go at it was what was called the Combined Arms Group. Now this was to some extent the brainchild of Churchill, although others were included, where they realised that if they were going to re-invade, if you will, or invade the France to clear it out of occupied France, to clear it out of German occupation, it was going to have to be a combined effort of the Navy and Special Commando landing craft, the Air Force and the Army and all that thing. All the services would have to combine in order to produce a workable and potent invasion force. And this need to work together was what the Combined Arms Group was all about, bringing all these branches of the military together to facilitate a future landing in France to reconquer Europe. Now, they considered for these pinprick type attacks various towns and ports along the French coast, but they chose Dieppe. It was a smallish town, but a medium-sized port, and there was a large radio antenna installation nearby. They wanted to knock that out. But as much as anything, it was they wanted to have a dress rehearsal. So they didn't want to go to a heavily defended area of the French coast. And Dieppe only had about 1,500 second-rate German soldiers sort of spread around the wider area. So they figured this would be not too difficult a task. Now, just to define fiascos, or a military fiasco in this case, and it can be seen in stark relief as the fiasco outcomes occur within a short time span. So it's not something that dribbles out over weeks or months, although you can have that. But this is something that happens in 1 or 2, maybe 3 days at the most. And it puts on show numerous silly, rookie, sloppy type mistakes that you'd expect out of beginners, people in their first year at military school or something. It's that level of mistake and casual oversight, and each mistake has a multiplier effect, which when you sort of in aggregation and accumulation, you look at all the mistakes, the impact or their negative impact has on the next mistake and the next mistake. So it all has a multiplier effect. So what seem to be relatively small mistakes, such as a mistiming or landing in the wrong place or something like that, when you add it all together, it turns into a super blunder or fiasco. Similarly, it's where going into battle, one side appears to hold, on the face of at least, most, if not all, the advantages, but manages to squander those advantages, again, through sloppy planning and so on, and then that makes it all the more of a fiasco, because it would appear at the outset that success was staring them in the face. So it's the ability to seize outright defeat from the jaws of almost certain victory. As it turns out, the Dieppe raid was a fiasco of crescendo level proportions. First-year officer cadet trainees could not have made this many mistakes or stuffed it up so badly. What makes this even more of a fiasco is an astonishing one at that, is the creme de la creme of the British military establishment planned or reviewed or resourced this venture. So the very best of Britain. For example, General Montgomery, who fancied himself as the best battlefield general that the British had, he reviewed it. General Brooke, who fancied himself as being the best logistics and operational organiser of the armed forces, he had a hand in looking at the planning and looking over the logistics, along with many other military luminaries of the day. I mean, this was the very best the British had to offer in planning, and military capability were involved in this. It wouldn't have been possible to get in British terms, to get a more credentialed bunch of people to be involved in this operation. Now, Lord Louis Mountbatten had almost no frontline military experience, and the frontline experience he had in the Navy was something of very unpromising, and there was nothing really to suggest or point to that he should be in charge of this combined in terms of his military expertise or capability. But he was a member of the royal family, and he also was very tactful and charming, or was described as much. And so he was kind of a good committee chairman, because his tact and diplomacy could soothe bruised egos, and could bring people to the table who otherwise would go, I'm not going to come to that meeting if so-and-so's there. Mountbatten could talk to them and pacify them and get them to come to the meeting. So that's a pretty important skill when you're looking at combining a number of armed services, all of whom are jealously want to guard their prerogatives and the like, and the petty bureaucracy and so on that goes with it. So he had quite a skill there. Also, getting resources launch these raids wasn't easy in itself. All the branches of the military were squabbling and struggling to get resources. But Mountbatten had a direct line to Churchill. He could pick up the phone and say, look, I need money or resources or people to do this, and he'd get it. And so his tact and diplomacy in dealing with difficult people and his ability to get resources quickly because of his direct line to Churchill made him probably a decent enough chairman of the committee or the senior committee member. Now, he was looked down upon by the lifelong sort of military men who viewed him as a bit of a show pony, that sort of thing, but no one doubted his tact and diplomacy or his zeal and his good intentions. So that kind of got him across the line, I guess. Now, there was also quite a cynical thing by the various generals and other military players. They wanted to be close enough to the operation that they could claim success if it went well, but far enough away from it that if it all turned into a blunder, disaster or fiasco, it had nothing to do with me. So there was that sort of bureaucratic jockeying to be just in that right position, so they could escape blame for failure. So it's hardly a mood of esprit de corps. Given that only months before the British were terrified they were going to be invaded and that would be the end of everything, and now they're squabbling over who should have priority in the seating arrangement at these meetings. I know it's crazy, but that's the sort of thing that was going on. The Germans didn't have that problem. They were getting on with the business. These guys were in my view, poncing about. Now, Mountbatten ended up taking more of a leading role in pushing the operation forward, as the other branches of the military were lukewarm and were competing with each other to some extent, and none of them wanted to take second place in what they sort of should have been. The Air Force, well, it should be us because we're doing, and the Navy said, well, no, we should be, and the Army was. So again, Mountbatten did I think quite a reasonable job actually of bringing these people together and trying to get agreement from them, even though he was no military genius, far from it, in fact. Now, given the small scale of the raid, as it turned out, the losses within the space of a few hours were eye-watering. Several thousand soldiers killed, captured or wounded. Over 30 naval vessels were lost. 100 aircraft were shot down, for goodness sakes. 50 tanks and other vehicles were lost, and quite a lot of war material, such as ammunition, mortars, and so on. Now, Wehrmacht losses in the meantime, and this gives you a idea of the scale of the fiasco. Wehrmacht losses were a few hundred soldiers, 3 small vessels, 40-odd aircraft. Now, this is, when you compare the losses of both sides, this was a crushing victory for the Wehrmacht. And bear in mind, they were outnumbered 4-1. So what went wrong? So let's come to that now. The original plan or conception of this raid in Dieppe required an intense bombing of the local area for the purposes of knocking out any Wehrmacht strong points and reducing any formidable looking defences they may have had, taking out gun emplacements and so on. Now, it also needed up-to-date verified intelligence and good quality intelligence. They had plenty of agents running around in France and so on. They could have done something pretty decent there. It also needed Marines and commandos experienced in amphibious landings. It needed heavy gun naval support from battleships or heavy cruisers that could go well offshore but could fire well inland with heavy shells and explosives. It needed 200 plus fighter aircraft, and it needed complete stealth of operations in order to achieve complete surprise. Now, almost immediately this sort of planning was dismantled or under threat. The bombing couldn't be done, so it was argued, because they didn't want to cause French civilian casualties in the town. That's fair enough, by the way. I do understand that, but then that still leaves the issue: well, how do we soften up the Wehrmacht strong points and gun emplacements if we can't bomb them? And that seemed to be who cares? And they were going straight on. And I'm surprised they just seemed to blithely wave that away when, as far as I'm concerned, at least that was a pretty serious consideration. And the bombing to soften the place up would have been, I would have thought, pretty much something that had to happen before you go ahead with an operation like this. Now, the bombing would have been immediately beforehand, but equally it would have been a potential or possible warning for the Wehrmacht defenders. Intelligence gathering the intelligence they had was fairly old and unverified, and you think they'd have at least attempted to cross-verify it, so they knew A, it was accurate, and B, up to date. But they didn't do this, strangely. One of the attitudes that was put forward was they didn't want to make a big deal of getting intelligence, because if spies were out looking for this stuff and the Germans caught them, then that would give the operation away. There seems like an odd sort of point of view to take. Good quality intelligence is vital before you undertake these sort of missions, and the idea of, we don't really need that. So the only thing they really had was old intelligence that was a couple of years old, and high altitude reconnaissance photos from aircraft, which really didn't tell them anything, and was, at the end of the day, pretty much useless. The Navy argued, and quite reasonably really, that given it was such a low reward, pinprick type operation, why should they risk one of their precious capital battleships or heavy cruisers? Remember, the Royal Navy had lost quite a few of their ships by this stage, so why would they want to risk another capital ship? And they conceded it was needed, or would have been very helpful for the operation, but the Navy argued that why should we risk one of our capital ships on an operation that is going to achieve almost nothing anyway? So, and that was not unreasonable, I think. But instead of working out, well, what else are we now going to do, the Navy offered some smaller destroyers that had small caliber guns and couldn't fire very far inland. So their artillery support from the guns of the destroyers was not decisive and was effortlessly avoided by the Wehrmacht, who just moved their guns around and so on. So it achieved almost nothing, the fire from the destroyers. But that should have been a major consideration whether or not they went ahead with this project. Now, whilst in the final landing, some small detachments of Marines and commandos who had experience at amphibious landings were used, but the idea was that all of the soldiers to be used would be experienced commandos and Marines, but instead they just had a few of them, and then they substituted the experienced Marines and commandos for untrained Canadians who'd never done any amphibious landing, or they did a few test runs, but that was shortly before that, but that was it. So that to me would have been a nail in the coffin there of this project. Well, why go ahead now? Given the aircraft fighter complement that they people were talking about, we need 250 fighters because they needed to defend the landing groups from getting strafed and so on, but they also needed a second level of fighter support to protect the fighters that were protecting the troops. So they needed a lot of aircraft. They didn't know how many Luftwaffe aircraft were in the area, but they figured 250, which was about right, by the way. But this was cut by 25 or so percent, and that ended up being not decisive necessarily, but it certainly made a difference as the British lost over 100 aircraft. The other thing was there was no forward spotter aircraft assigned to scout ahead of the naval flotilla as it left England for Dieppe. And it's about a 100-kilometre journey, point to point. And it was essential that they had spotter aircraft and the reconnaissance vessels going ahead, but they didn't. This was an incredible oversight for supposed professionals. Now, to compensate for these changes or reductions in what was initially deemed as necessary to go ahead with the raid, rather than abandon the operation or even adjust its scope, either one would have been, adjusting its scope, for example, would have been sensible under the circumstances. But instead of that, they changed the concept of the planning. So they say, okay, we can't have all these things such as the bombing and the heavy battleships and this. So what we'll do is we'll have an exquisitely timed and coordinated series of landings in perfect sequence and in perfect place and this sort of thing, and that will compensate, and we'll have complete surprise, and that'll compensate for the lack of these other things that are particularly important. And this is again quite astonishing. That level of, and I know from business, where you've got a complex sort of matrix of things happening, trying to get it all to go off perfectly timed, and even with the best intentions and some pretty decent people and supervisors sort of watching closely, it's still very hard to get that sort of level of perfection and coordination. So now there were 5 separate naval flotillas leaving England with 13 separate battle groups that were to be landed across a 10-mile front, as well as landing, close on 100 tanks, or probably 80 tanks, I think, overall, but over 100 vehicles if you include, jeeps and the like. So this is going to require. So I mean, just consider this: 13 battle groups across a 10-mile front, landing over 100 vehicles and 6,000 men. this is it's not, I wouldn't call it a monumental undertaking, but it needs to be the planning needs to be exquisite for all this to go off without a hitch. On top of that, they're all meant to be landing in darkness and or at very first light, so they've got the jump on the Wehrmacht in Dieppe. Now, any junior planner, one of my jobs as a young guy being a logistics planner at one company, I learned then how easy it is for things to go wrong. There's nowhere near the sort of high stakes that these people had. But for some reason, any junior planner knows in any capacity that planning that tight means that the tiniest mistake results in a cascading series of compromising events, and that adding heavy firepower, as in the tanks, to the least decisive area of the landing, which is getting off the beach, is almost a pre-admission of failure. Now, somehow, and this beggars belief, is the intelligence that they had failed to notice the many Wehrmacht heavy gun emplacements that had been installed around the cliffs with clear open sights to the beach. So they've got German heavy artillery, a clear sight to the beach where the British and Canadians are landing, and the British didn't know. The intelligence we had no idea those guns were there. Now, you've got heavy artillery raining shells down on you, and sure, it's landing on sand and shale. So, but nonetheless, this is an incredible oversight. Now, and all these guns these Wehrmacht guns were firing down on all the landing areas that the British were, and they were quite well camouflaged, but they easily could have been identified by on the ground, even basic level intelligence. Also, another huge oversight in intelligence was that the Germans had recently installed a radar station, and this was easily pick up a naval flotilla en route and thus prevent any possibility of surprise, of which the mission was now heavily reliant. And now, just coming back, the British would have an overall 4-to-1 superiority of ground troops. And again, the Wehrmacht troops were mostly older men, not all, but mostly older men in their 40s. The British had air and naval superiority, and they had huge superiority in tanks and mortars, not machine guns. If the landing went off perfectly, it was still possible they could have achieved something positive, but it had to be perfect. So when the big day arrived in August 1942, how did events actually unfold? I mean, there's more than 200 vessels on the water, going from 5 English ports again to deliver 13 battle groups across 10 miles over the wider area. Now, their mission was to knock out a radar tower that was nearby, or a transmission tower, not necessarily radar, destroy whatever military infrastructure they could find, grab a few prisoners for interrogation, get back on the boats on the same day and be gone before major reinforcements could arrive. Well, that was the idea. But it's difficult to imagine so many things could go wrong in this one small operation. I mean, was it possible to make this many mistakes? The German radar picked up suspicious signals suggesting there was a naval squadron of some size on the water, but they weren't sure. But anyway, they passed it on to the local Wehrmacht officers and planning centres. So they were on a status for alert anyway, and the British are still more than an hour away. So surprise was lost. Then a little bit later, the flotilla, again, they've got no spotting aircraft or vessels going ahead. They come across a few smaller German vessels who spot them and then radio back in. So now there's no surprise left, nothing. The Germans know that these dudes are coming and they're heading for Dieppe's the only port in the area it can be, so they know not only that there's a large flotilla on its way, but where it's going. So surprise is completely gone. And now, so they're on full alert. So they're on full alert from an hour. It's still an hour before the flotilla starts unloading men and material and all. So the Germans have got over an hour to prepare. Now, mayhem broke out sort of almost straight away because the landing groups landed out of sequence. So, these guys are meant to go first, then those, but they landed out of sequence. The communication between them was abysmal. It's hard to believe, again, just the amateurishness of this. Some were landed more than a mile away from the spot where they were supposed to land. This was sort of the tides and the currents were so strong. Well, why? What's that got to do with it? You still need to land in the place. Troops still need to be delivered to the right spot. So even the various groups couldn't coordinate amongst themselves on the ground once they were on the beaches and the landing grounds because they were too far apart. Some that were the initial groups were supposed to land in complete darkness and spike any guns and take control of the beach area and the immediate sort of waterfront area. But those groups were landed again out of sequence and none of them were landed in darkness. All of them landed in daylight, and they were being shot to pieces by the guns. Now the tanks and other tracked vehicles, half tracks, that sort of thing, they were landed on, I think this was the intended place, but they were landed on shingle beaches where there's lots of rock and stones and sharp stones and so on, these shingle beaches. So when you've got caterpillar tracks, as you do on a tank, and you try and sort of move sideways or anything other than dead straight, and even then, the pieces of shingle and the rock get caught up in the tracks and they foul the track. The tracks break or they seize in position, and the tank isn't going anywhere. So the tanks will land, but no one had thought about this. No one had considered or given even a second's thought about landing on shingle beaches. They all knew how unsuitable tracks were for shingle beaches, but no one thought about the shingle beaches at Dieppe. So they just landed these tracked vehicles on there, and nearly all of them seized up on the beach, and the ones that didn't seize up were typically taken out by the artillery. The few that made it off the beach were then taken out by field artillery pieces that the Wehrmacht had in the town. So this was a terrible error, a terrible oversight. It immobilised all the tanks, and had the tanks been able to get off the beach quickly and get into the town, things might have been a little bit different. But it turns out, because of this ridiculous oversight, or two oversights, one was the shingle getting caught in the caterpillar tracks, the other one was the German heavy guns that were camouflaged and were aimed directly at the beach. So now on the beaches, the British communication between the groups and with communication back to the command vessel offshore, the communication was diabolical. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew, had anyone achieved their objectives? Should more troops be landed? Should more tanks be brought in? What was the status of this? Had they got off? Had they captured the centre of the town? All this. You'd think these things, they had no beachmaster to hand. The planning was diabolically bad, and the organisation was diabolically bad. So nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew what was going on. It's hard to believe that, again, the very best of the British military establishment had planned or at least reviewed these plans. Shocking amateurism. Now, the British made some effort to try and recover a morsel of the situation by going into the town and trying to seize a bridge, so they could take the centre of town. But even this, again, this is when you're up against a professional, capable army with well-trained officers, that the German officers on the spot were able to effortlessly predict what the British would do, and were always one step ahead. So the British will try and capture that bridge. They'll try and come down here. They'll try and do that. And so even though the Germans were hopelessly outnumbered, they were always able to have men in the right place at the right time to block the British, or indeed even to counterattack. So the Germans were fully anticipating all the British moves and the things that they did, and so they were able the Wehrmacht were able to establish complete battlefield superiority, even though they're outnumbered 4-1. Now, by the afternoon of that day, it was sinking in. The position was hopeless. They weren't going to achieve really any of their objectives. I think they managed to spike one gun emplacement, but that was it. And thousands, and so they decided to retreat and evacuate quite hurriedly, leaving behind thousands of men to dead and dying, to be taken as prisoners and injured. Now the British military establishment tried to put a brave face on the disaster, claiming that these critical lessons had been learned, and okay, it was costly, but we learned so much, and these lessons can be put to good effect later. I don't buy that for a minute, unless the lessons were not to be so mind-bogglingly sloppy, amateurish and useless when playing around with so many people's lives. Maybe then they learnt that lesson, but one would hope and suspect they'd already knew that. Remember, this is the very best of the military establishment. So this was an unmitigated fiasco in my view, and completely avoidable if there'd been better planning and a more sensible approach to the whole project and the whole raid. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.